All right, I think we can probably begin. So happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on an evidence-based approach for coastal flood risk assessments. My name is Bohan Lee. I'm a research associate at ICLR, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. So before we begin, I'm just going to go through a few administrative items. If you have any questions, we'll be taking those at the end. So if you have a question during the presentation, you can please submit it into the Q&A feature. The Q&A feature can be accessed by a button near the bottom of your Zoom window. And you can just put those in. I'll record those. I will ask those at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, you can put those in chat. Please send those questions to the host, which is ICLR, and Sarah will help you out with those. And finally, something a little bit different from our usual Friday Forum webinars. The presenter, Nicky, has requested that if you want, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the chat as well to everyone. And there will also be some questions at the end about your experiences with coastal flood risk assessments. And you can discuss those in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Nicky Hastings. Nicky Hastings is the project lead for the National Scale Geohazard Risk project within the Public Safety Geoscience Program at Natural Resources Canada. Over the last 14 years, she has worked with the team to develop and adapt risk assessment methods to assess Canada's earthquake and flood risks. Nicky works closely with internal and external partners to better understand how scientific knowledge can inform decision-making. Several initiatives are underway in the risk project, including a new 5-year project under the emergency management strategy that operationalizes evidence-based methods to evaluate and prioritize earthquake risk reduction measures and other natural hazards. And so now Nicky will give her presentation on coastal flood mitigation.
Thank you, Bohan, and happy Friday. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're coming from. I just want to first, and thank you for taking your time out of your day to come listen to talk. I hope this is of relevance and interest to you. I just want to first start off and acknowledge that I'm presenting today from the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh Coastal First Nation people out here in the West Coast. And today we're talking about coastal flooding. If you're not here to listen to that, then you might be in the wrong session, but we should have, hoping to have a good discussion with you all to learn a little bit more about some of the work that's underway in this new project. So this is an overview of what we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to start off by talking about some new guidelines that we're working on for coastal flooding, and then referencing a couple of new case studies across each one of Canada's coast. So as you know, Canada has the longest coastline in the world. Lots to think about and consider about in terms of coastal flooding. And this is not really all about me. This is really about a team of people that made this happen. So what you're looking at is the research team. So on the left-hand side is the core team of people that are involved in this project. And some of them may be on the call today, and they may be more expert than me on some of these subjects. So you may see some of our colleagues other colleagues from Natural Resources Canada. So Jackie Yip or Julie Vandevalk, Mike Ellerbeck out here in the Vancouver region. And then very closely working together in the core team, a group from the National Research Council, so Enda Murphy, Sean Ferguson, and Joseph Kim, who may also be on the call as well. We're also experts in this area. And then we have a broader research team of people that are working on various components of the project. And it really couldn't happen with this group of people. So those are other people from the Geological Survey of Canada here at Natural Resources Canada. We have people from Indigenous Services Canada, Brent Barron, Emergency Management British Columbia, the University of Victoria, Ocean Networks Canada, Indigenous and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And this whole project that I'm going to be talking to you today about couldn't have happened without funding and support from Defence Research Development Canada's Canadian Safety and Security Program. So the project is that I'll be talking about today is, as I mentioned, the number of different research partners that I've already highlighted. It was a three-year project, so we're in year 2 of the project. So we still have another year of the project underway, and there's a lot more work coming out of the project. It was a $1.5 million project funded through DRDC, a lot of in-kind support throughout the different research partners contributing. And it will be wrapping up in January 22. And so as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the key parts of the project were to develop and demonstrate best practices for coastal flooding and coastal flooding hazard assessment and risk assessment to help coastal communities better understand how to mitigate against things like storm surge, tsunamis, and sea level rise. And as I mentioned, we work closely with a number of communities across the country. So a community on the west coast, Pacific coast, the Boundary Bay region, a community in the north coast of the Arctic coast, and a community in the east coast, the Atlantic coast. And these communities, the work that was undertaken in the communities really helps to inform the new guidelines that are being developed. They help to inform risk reduction planning and decision making, and we're generating a lot of new hazard data that you will see as we go through the slides. And we've also had an opportunity to develop some new flood damage modeling tools, which I'll briefly highlight. So just to let you know, the guidelines that I've been mentioning are part of the Federal Floodplain Mapping Guidelines series. Some of you may be aware of this guideline series that is being led by our group at the Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation at NRCan, along with Public Safety Canada. So there are about 10 guidelines now that are under development and or have been published right now. So it's really a comprehensive look at the various components of flood risk assessment. So with the guideline we'll be talking about today, it's really going to be focused on just the coastal flood hazard assessment. So actually today, even though my expertise is in risk assessment, I'll be predominantly talking about flood hazard assessment. Maybe down the line, we could have another ICLR conference to talk about the risk results. So those are not yet developed, they're underway, and they should be pretty exciting pieces of work. Yeah, so as you can see from the circle on the left-hand side, there's various components when we think about the floodplain mapping guidelines series, from understanding the priorities to data acquisition to how the flood estimation guidelines. So there's 2 components. So right now underway, there's a new hydraulic and hydrodynamic guideline, we call it the H&H guideline, that's underway, that's focused on the river side of things. And we're working closely with that group to make sure the coastal hazard side of things align with it. And it falls into a piece eventually coming around to doing the risk assessment, which is another guideline that we've been connecting closely with, and then looking at flood mitigation. And if you want access or need to know where to find those guidelines, I can provide you with a link later. So let's focus and zoom in specifically at the coastal flood hazard guidelines. We're taking a procedural guidance approach to identify best practices. And we're using a risk-based approach. So not looking at just a single scenario, but thinking about what are the range of scenarios and the range of different approaches that can impact the community. And the other key piece we're looking at is making sure that we address not just current flood conditions, coastal flood conditions. We know that sea level rise is a major issue for coastal communities, and so we're addressing future flood hazard conditions as well. And so you might ask, who is this guideline for? Well, it's predominantly addressed at practitioners, but that said, we do have a section that's intended to focus on the provinces and territories, those people who are actually trying to understand and put together the RFPs that may need to be done in communities. So those are the people who may not be doing the modeling work, but need to understand what type of questions to ask and what type of pieces of information need to be addressed when developing coastal flood hazard models. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a collaborative project, the guidelines series. It has we are working closely together with the case studies, as I mentioned, and we have a core project team that's contributing to this process. It's in place right now. So there's 4 major components, the coastal flood hazard guidelines. So the first part of this presentation, I'm going to drill in a little bit to the new coastal flood hazard guidelines that's underway, so you can get a sense of what's coming down the pipe, and it may be of interest to you or some of your colleagues. So down the road, when we get to the Q&A, please ask any questions. We really want this guideline to be for you people that are needing guidance and information and can learn from other communities' best practices. So there's There's really 4 components that we're going to be addressing today, and those are in the blue boxes that you can see on your screen. So the first piece is really the preliminary identification of objects, objectives, scenarios, and hazards. And then we're going to go into data collection, and then into the hazard assessment itself, that's the hazard modeling, and then making sure that the actual hazard assessments that you run can communicate in a way that's meaningful to decision makers. And then, of course, the hazard assessment feeds directly into the risk assessment component. So that's understanding the impacts and consequences that communities face so that they can inform their decision making. And then, of course, all the while, community and partner engagement is an important process throughout. So as I mentioned, the flood, I'm really going to touch briefly on the flood risk assessment, but I also want to let you know that throughout this project, we've been able to develop a new flood risk assessment tool. Some of you may be aware of it. It's called CanFlood. It's a new open source flood risk assessment tool. It brings together a standardized approach. It's adaptable. It uses the QGIS open source modeling software as a plugin, so you can freely download it, access it, use it. And of course, it relies on, you can access the manuals and tutorials from our GitHub page. So if you go to github.com/nrcan/canflood, you'll find the manual, you'll find some tutorials to work with, and any opportunities to answer questions. And of course, the model is dependent on being able to provide information from the flood hazard, like the flood depth and flood velocities. You need your asset inventory information and your vulnerability function. So some of that's embedded, some of it's not in connections to it, but that's the flood risk assessment, which I'm not really going to talk about today, but I just wanted to make you aware of it if you weren't aware of CanFlood flood risk modeling tool. So community and partner engagement, as I mentioned, it's a key part. That's the orange box at the top. Really important to make sure that often you find that the people who are doing the coastal flood modeling are not the people who live in the community. They are not aware of some of the key issues. So really want to stress the importance of having strong community and partner engagement. People who know and have lived through floods over the years have incredible intelligence and insight into some of the situations. So it makes your project stronger and the community stronger when you bring the researchers together with the community, making sure that you meet the community on a regular basis and inform throughout the process. Let's move into the next blue box on the bottom, and that is, we're going to be focusing on the preliminary identification. So what we discussed first, and this is the section I talked about where we're focused on predominantly the people who are having to write the RFPs, the people who are having to figure out what work needs to be done. So these are the kind of questions that we want you to think about when and give you guidance on as you're thinking about what work needs to be done in my community. What am I trying to get out of this work? Am I using it for land use planning? Am I using it for emergency management decisions? What kind of decisions do we need to make from this type of work? And then figuring out what information you may have already if you've got a number of studies that are done already. So making sure you document all those pieces and be aware of what's been done beforehand. And of course, the scale of analysis is really key. Am I doing really a detailed scale? Am I looking at more regional assessment? What areas do I need to include? What partners do I need to include if we're doing a regional assessment? And then the other thing is we really want to make sure what we've seen in the past is that some situations, people are only looking at a single scenario. We're really trying to push towards a risk-based approach, which is look at a range of different scenarios. One scenario may happen, but that may not be the scenario that impacts the community. So thinking about what are those ranges of scenarios. And then the other thing is thinking about some of the hazard sources that you have that can affect your community. What do we need to be thinking about? Do we need to be thinking about tsunamis? And what type of tsunamis do we need to be thinking about? Do you need to be thinking about storms, and what type of storms? So that's a guidance on that first section. That's preliminary identification. Let's move to the next section, the data collection section. So this is really intended for our practitioners. The community practitioners may be engineers or consulting companies that you hire. So what do practitioners need to be thinking about? So elevation, of course, is a key component to coastal flood hazard assessment. And it's not just the land elevation, it's also the bathymetry information. So we put together this section to think and talk about where you can get information from, what kind of issues and challenges you might have getting access to some of these informations, and showing examples from the 3 case studies that I'll talk about a little bit later about how and where we collected that type of information from. So you can see hazard sources, water levels, and then thinking about the very different regional data products needed. So for instance, in our West Coast study, we did a detailed development of an elevation data set that didn't exist for the community, but there was quite a bit of work to actually build that elevation data set. So we can talk about that a little bit later, thinking about what that might look like. And then let's move our next box over to the hazard assessment. So this is your modeling side of things. This is your coastal flood modeling. And the people who do your data collection may be different people that do the hazard assessment component. So here you really want to be thinking about the range, and we're giving guidance on the range of different scenarios. So whether we're doing a regional scale assessment, as you see on the image on the right-hand side of Atlantic region, and whether you're zooming into community scale and how you bridge that gap between the regional and community scale assessments. So, and then thinking carefully, we have some good discussions about likelihoods and taking that into account. What type of modeling tools can be used for coastal flood modeling, whether it's tsunami modeling tools, whether it's storm modeling tools, considerations for calibration and validation, and how to incorporate the climate change and relative sea level rise. So it's quite a technical chapter, this section here. And then finally, on the guideline, thinking about communicating results. So we have a section on the different ways that information of coastal flood hazards, I'm talking specifically about the hazard maps, hazard can be communicated to the different types of audience. So we know that for decision-making purposes, what the general public needs is very different than what an engineer needs for maps. So then engineering maps would be much more detailed. Emergency management maps may be thinking more about evacuation and what type of, thinking about webinar sessions and information and how to get the information out, So we talk about those range of different ways to communicate. So hopefully that provides some good guidance in the types of products that ultimately need to come out of the modeling work. So where are we at with the guideline right now? So we're anticipating a draft guideline by fall. So pretty soon we're doing quite a bit of work writing some content together with the crew that I showed you on the first slide, the second slide with all the people that are involved. We are then going to look for, we're putting together an expert review committee who can then, these are typically practitioners or some of the provinces and territories who can look at the what we've written so far and provide us guidance and feedback to make sure what we're doing is reasonable and makes sense. And then by spring 2022, we're anticipating to have a final bilingual version of the guideline that will be available for general use. That's our plan. Now I'm going to zoom away from the guideline series towards some of the case studies. So the first case study we're going to look at is on the Pacific coast, and this is what we're calling our Boundary Bay case study. And we worked very, very closely with the community of Semiahmoo First Nation. So for those of you who don't know, we're Semiahmoo First Nation on the west coast. We then zoom into the lower mainland region, which is the middle image. Many of you will know the lower mainland region, and Boundary Bay is the big bay. Just you probably, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but it's this large bay right here that we're looking at and focusing on. It's quite shallow. Here we're zooming into the Boundary Bay right here, and you can see the predominant feature is the Canada-US boundary. So Semiahmoo First Nation is a community that's situated right along the Canada-US boundary. They were actually, as the boundary was put in place, their community was cut in half, and half of their relatives live on the American side and the other half live on the Canadian side. So it was an interesting case study to work with, given that they had a lot of communication, as I mentioned, their relatives living on both sides, knowing and understanding what was happening with the Canadian side and what the US side in terms of some of the work, modeling work and understanding of coastal flooding on both sides of the border. So there's some differences which made it quite an interesting area to work with. So Semiahmoo First Nation has about less than 100 people, many of them living on the reserve. So the reserve is that smaller little kind of a triangle section at the bottom, right next to one of the largest municipalities in the lower mainland region, Surrey and White Rock. And the community only recently got access to drinking water as well as sewer lines, which is hard to believe, but it's an urban area, but that's beside the point right now. So the importance, what I really want to stress is we had an excellent opportunity because at a recent conference, one of the counselors from Semiahmoo First Nation stood up and said, we're a community that we have this conflicting information and knowledge about our understanding of tsunamis in the region. The Canadian government is saying one thing and the US government is saying another. and we don't know what to believe. So we've gone ahead. We know that we've had a history of flooding in the area, and that Chief Harley Chappelle talked to us first as a research team when we got together, and they talked about 14 floods that happened in the region. We don't know whether they happen from the coast or whether they happen from the river. We suspect both. But this community, because of their awareness of coastal flooding, they're the only community in the lower mainland of Metro Vancouver region that has a warning siren that they test on a regular basis. There's some incredible knowledge in the community about flooding and about the region, of course, having nearly 10,000 years of oral stories that they shared with us. So our goal is to then start to understand what is the flooding in the region? Is it coastal flooding? And so we've done we've already gone into the community and done what we call paleo tsunami studies. And that's what we've been looking at sections in the land. We've cut some sections to see what's the sedimentary record of tsunami storms. So you can see in the soil records, you can see a layer of sand that comes through if a large tsunami has come through the region. We didn't detect any so far in the region, although we do know that there have been some deposits detected and discovered just south of the border of the US in the Birch Bay region. So let's move into, remember I talked about the guidelines, so we talked about data collection. So one of the key things that we had to build in the region was a very robust elevation model, what we call a TOPI-BATHO, the digital elevation model. So topography is the land, Bathy is the ocean, and one of the challenges we had is there was bits and pieces of elevation data sets, but we had a limitation on really high quality elevation data sets in the near shore region, which is really important when you're doing coastal modeling. You need to have good elevations. You want to know how the wave moves through the region and what it means for the community. So we worked closely with Ocean Networks Canada, who were part of the team, and they ran a number of workshops, had quite a few people. You can see the photo of the image setting up the workshop. This was obviously way before COVID. We could get together, and communities were really generous in the region to share their elevation data sets. Some communities had high quality LiDAR data sets, and then Canadian Hydrographic Services was really generous in sharing some of the bathymetry data sets, and they flew some high new water LiDAR data sets for the region. And that was all stitched together, making sure we had the right vertical data and that all the pieces matched and, the boundaries stitched together. So quite a bit of work was done on the elevation model to make it happen. So I just kind of want to give you a quick snap in terms of what that looked like for some, and that'll be of concern for other communities. Some communities will have high quality elevation data sets, some won't, and it can take quite a bit of effort to collect some of that data set. The other thing I also want to recognize is that we've brought in partners from the US, from NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Association, just across the border, who were doing some work, and they were able to share some data sets too, so that we can have that true Canada-US elevation data set. Hazard assessment, what does that look like? So we'll start with storms. So we know this area is hit by storms. You can see on the right-hand side, the December 2018 storm, which took out the White Rock Pier. Some of you may remember or may have heard of that impact. So what we've seen now, when we work closely with our partners at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Rick Thompson, who ran and led work with his team to do some new modeling, some storm modeling for the area using the Princeton model. And the big thing is, big takeaway, we added a number of different sea level rise scenarios. So we looked at the current day storm, the 2050, what it would look like in 2050, what it would look like in 2100. And then we also took it out to 2200. And we took it out that far because our colleagues across the US use slightly different sea level rise scenarios. So we wanted to make sure that our work would align and make sure that when the community finally had the information, they could see the differences and start to see how to integrate that knowledge across the Canada-US border when you have two different jurisdictions doing different approaches. So the significant parts of Boundary Bays get quite shallow. Those of you who've taken the ferry across to Vancouver Island, you can see it gets quite shallow. You can see the mud. Mud Bay is called Mud Bay for a reason, as the tide goes in and out. And so we know in shallow areas, the storm surge amplitudes are quite higher, can be a bit higher. And this area in the lower mainland range in particular experiences more storms and more wave impacts than most of the lower mainland region. So we have to be concerned. A lot of it as the future sea level rise, a lot of it, the dikes are currently not built to future sea level rise conditions. And these areas are some of them lower than sea level rise right now. So definitely some serious flooding in this region to be considered. Let's move towards tsunami scenarios. Sorry, excuse me. Tsunamis, they're not one type of tsunamis that can happen. So some of you may not even know, you may not have heard, I had never heard of meteor tsunamis before. So that was a new one that our colleagues from BFO introduced us to. Landslide generated tsunamis, local earthquake triggered tsunamis. So in this case, the Cascadia earthquake from 1700, where the full rupture happened just off the coast of Vancouver Island. We're going to talk about a number of different ways that ruptured and how the tsunami scenario would affect this region. Distant earthquakes, like the one where you don't feel the shaking, but if the tsunami warning system works well, you know that the tsunami wave will be coming and the earthquake shaking is happening. And then the other interesting thing we looked at was a number of different shallow crustal earthquakes that trigger tsunamis. These are they have not been studied quite as well as the other types of local subduction zone triggered earthquakes. So let's start with our meteor tsunamis. So meteor tsunamis, as I mentioned, not a lot known about them, but we do know that from 2005 to 2020, a number have been reported. You basically see them on the tide charts. You see these large waves coming in, and at first they couldn't figure out where they came from, and it happens with different atmospheric conditions. And so what we're looking at is meteor tsunami. We remodeled the event that happened from November 1st, 2010, and looked at it if it came from different directions, and looked at slightly different wind speeds and what it looked like. And what the conclusion we came to really in the end was the meteor tsunamis were not a major issue for the region, but they do happen, and we do need to be aware of them. But we didn't know at this point in time, before the modeling had carried out, whether they would be a big concern. It's a different case for across the country. I think they might be a bigger concern on the Atlantic region, and also a concern in the Great Lakes. So more modeling work needs to be done in the future to look at what meteor tsunamis look for in other regions across the country. But we had a chance to study them here in the West Coast. Landslide generated tsunamis. This work is still underway, and it's our colleagues at the University of Victoria, PhD student Fatima Namati, along with Lucinda Leonard, are working on some landslide generated tsunamis. So we're looking at just south of the region in the US, Orcas Island. We know that there's some scarp failures that have happened and that could trigger some wave impacts. We wanted to look at what that would mean in terms of impact to the Boundary Bay region. So that's work that's still underway, but yet to come out. Cascadia subduction. So we looked at, without sea level rise, we just looked at current conditions. Cascadia, this is a full rupture of the Cascadia Fault. Cascadia Fault runs from northern Vancouver Island all the way down to northern California. It would impact all of that region in the coastline. So, but it impacts communities differently. So getting a sense of what it looks like. And in terms of how the fault can rupture, it can rupture in different ways. So we've looked, this is a full rupture. We're looking at a number of ways that rupture. We looked at the buried fault rupture and the splay fault rupture. Splay fault rupture is one fault triggers another component of the fault to rupture. And interesting enough, even though the splay fault rupture would be more damaging for the west coast of Vancouver Island and for the just down in Washington State, the buried fault rupture had more impact for the Boundary Bay region. So as you look at the third image, you can see the Boundary Bay region has the greatest, most significant part of run up and wave height from the Cascadia scenarios than any other part of the Lower Mainland region. So we do need to consider it, think about it. It's about a 1 meter wave that would come in, an inundation. So we're looking at and developing out those inundation maps right now in terms of what that looks like for Semiahmoo First Nation and the Boundary Bay region. And then, of course, when you add sea level rise, we want to think about not just current, because this may not rupture right now, but it may rupture by 2050 or it may rupture by 2100. And then what does it look like? We do know that it will eventually rupture, but just getting a sense of what it looks like. So we ran this scenario in particular at a number of different, with a number of different sea level rise scenarios. And we can see that it is quite significant and will impact the region for sure. So our colleagues with Semiahmoo First Nation weren't wrong in thinking that tsunamis they should be concerned about. Then, of course, we looked at the an earthquake that happened in 1964, just off the Alaska Panhandle. Shaking wasn't felt, but the tsunami wave was felt up and down the coast, all the way down to California. Crescent Beach community impacted it. Of course, the wave travels up some of those inlets. We wanted to get a sense of what did it look like in the Boundary Bay region. And in the end, I think we got about a 50 or 60 centimeter wave coming in roughly, coming into the community. So not a huge concern for Boundary Bay, but enough that they will notice a wave coming into the community. Shallow crustal faults. These are the faults that I mentioned have not been studied that well. And we know that some new knowledge happening just across the border, across the US. We looked at 3 different faults: the Birch Bay Fault, the Sandy Bit Point Fault, and Skipjack Island Fault, just off Orcas Islands. And the interesting thing about these faults is, in this case, the land is rising as opposed to dropping, like the subduction zone event. So you've got an impact of the land rising, and can rise up to about 2 meters. Plus, you've got the wave coming in. So slightly different things to think about in terms of that. This modeling is not yet quite complete and published yet. So we're still working on some of those pieces to get a good understanding of what it means for these tsunamis that would come in from these shallow crustal faults. We do know, as I mentioned, that there has been some evidence in Birch Bay of some tsunami deposits from some of these ruptures. We're just not sure yet which. More to that. So, and as I mentioned, once we've done all these hazard assessments, the next step will be moving into the risk assessment, which I'm really not going to talk about. But the risk assessment, you can look at a range from the strains on the social fabric. What does it mean to people in terms of the impacts to their pocketbooks? What does it in employment? What does it mean to social network, your network connections? What does it mean in terms of your individual autonomy? Those people who may be older or younger, limited different aging, education, mobility issues, thinking about housing conditions, and then moving into impacts on the built environment. So looking at what would this social disruption be in terms of evacuation and displacement needs? What would be the economic impacts to the region, to different sectors, thinking about what would be the impacts of lifelines, not just the lifeline individual buildings, but the lifeline services, the water, the power, the communication, the electricity, and so on. And then thinking about public safety. What are your needs for shelter requirements, emergency evacuation, critical injuries, needs for health, hospital and injuries, and then, of course, the impacts to buildings. Will some buildings collapse? Will some buildings, what buildings will be impacted more than others? And getting a sense of this information all leads to recovery, resilience, and understanding of the systemic risk. So I'm not really going to talk much more about risk assessment. Maybe in the future we can talk about this, because this work's still underway right now. And then I wanted to show you some of the risk communication maps. So these are the hazard communication maps. And I've given you some examples of other communities across Canada that have already, and the US as well, that have created some hazard evacuation, tsunami evacuation maps. And there's a number of different approaches. There's not a standardized approach right now, but I thought it'd be interesting for you to see what that might look like in terms of layering evacuation routes and getting an understanding of how people can get out of harm's way quickly. What's the safest, best way to get out? So, and as you see that there are a number of different tsunami scenarios, how do you layer that information, whether it's distant sources, local sources, and putting all that information together? So on the right-hand side, out of Oregon, Dogami group, the geology group out of Oregon have looked at a way to layer all the tsunami hazard zones onto one map. So let's move all the way from the west coast to the east coast to the Atlantic coast. We'll be moving into the Acadian Peninsula region and the New Brunswick. So the Acadian Peninsula, we first met with the province of New Brunswick. Our colleagues at National Research Council had really good working connections with the province, and they encouraged us. We asked, what region can we work together on to address coastal flooding? And they suggested the Acadian region. The Acadian region has about a number of small communities and has been experienced, very quite low-lying. Has experienced quite a bit of flooding. You talk here about those storms, and Atlantic region has been hit by a number of those storms and impacts the community. So the first thing we did was we connected with, there's a research group, a nonprofit group that works closely with the University of Moncton in Shippagan. They're called Valores. has been working closely with a lot of the communities, and we held a community workshop with Valoris and with New Brunswick. It's a francophone speaking region, and they brought together a number of communities from the region to come and talk about what was important to them about coastal flooding concerns, what information they needed, and helping us put together a project scope. And then after our workshop, we went to the community and did some community visits with province and with Valoris. We looked at some of the impacts of storm surge and flooding. We looked at some of the effects of wave and coastal erosion, and learned a lot of things about the impacts to some of the dunes and to the communities. And what we learned, so I put up some of the little blocks of information to show the kind of questions we asked. So it was a hands-on workshop. We pulled out some maps. We got them to put stickies on the map and show us the areas they were concerned about and why they were concerned about. And then they helped us with what we really needed to for our hazard modeling purposes. We need photographs and videos to understand where the impacts from historic storms has happened so we could validate our models. And then we asked the community what kind of information that they needed to help support their planning services and what were the local contexts we considered. So on the right-hand side, these are some of the, this is a little bit of the feedback that we learned from them. We learned that there's existing studies already that have been done, and we obviously wanted to build on those, not replicate existing work. Some interesting, I've just put a few points here. You can see like saltwater intrusion on peatlands. So peat mining is actually quite big in the region. Fishing, of course, is really big in the region, and tourism as well. They talked about the dunes being quite low-lying and very vulnerable. Some of the dunes had been excavated in the past, which had dropped them down even lower, making them more vulnerable. They talked about the importance of their port infrastructure, specifically in the Shippagan region, and the fish processing plant and wharf that are vulnerable to flooding. So a lot of discussion about impacts and what it meant to their community and what this means for the models. So we were asked to look at a number of different communities. So you can see on the right-hand side, so this is in northeast, way up in the tip of northeastern New Brunswick. And we looked specifically at the community. They've asked us to look at the communities of Maisonette, which is a small community on the north side of the peninsula. Caraquet and Back-Caraquet is a little bit bigger region, about 5,500 people. Lemec, which is a small community, about 1,200 people. Shippagan and Point Brûlé and Le Goulet. So I don't know if you're familiar with these regions, but really nice coastal communities in this region, in this francophone region on the tip of northern New Brunswick, that has, as I mentioned, experienced quite a bit of storm surge flooding and a lot of coastal erosion. So on the right-hand side, you've got the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So in terms of the data collection, the importance is we had to first work with moving into our community scale models, but we first developed some regional scale models. So those are larger scale models. So that's the box in the top is a larger regional scale model that was developed for the whole area that covers a larger area for the Atlantic coast to bring in the storms and look at what those large storms mean for the region as a whole. And these regional scale models then inform the more detailed community scale models. So as I mentioned, the elevation data sets, we put together the best available bathymetry from Canadian Hydrographic Service. We combined that together with our topographic data set. We had 1 meter resolution hydro-enforced DEM. And we used the roughness of the land to build together the elevation model, the flooding model. We put together boundary conditions based on the regional scale model, as I mentioned before, and then we brought together the wind and atmospheric pressure forcing from ERA4. And this is all done, then scaled at a model of 10 meter for the communities at a community scale. So the regional scale model, which is actually the component that's done first, you get a sense of what that looks like. You see on the left-hand side how large the area is. It covers Newfoundland, basically the whole lower southern Atlantic coast region. So it simulates and generates the evolution of storm surges on the Atlantic continental shelf. And then, as I mentioned, the community scale, which is much more fine. So we have to do these two steps, the regional scale to the community scale. And here's our regional scale model. So it was developed using Telemac 2D by our colleagues at National Research Council. And as I mentioned, it was forced by the wind and the atmospheric pressure conditions. And the resolution of the regional model is at a 30K model. And the resolution gets a little bit higher, closer to the Acadian Peninsula, about a 200-meter resolution. So the great thing about these models is they can be used for, and they're a good starting point for other models that could be generated for other regions in the area. So here's a little bit more detailed on our community scale model. You can see, you get to see some impacts and modeling of impacts to the buildings itself. And the key thing we wanted to make sure is we wanted to make sure the models were correct. So we used photographs, and you can see this photograph on the left-hand side to help determine whether our models were correct or not. And they actually lined up quite nicely. So we used some field survey data to validate the extents and calibrate the models. So not just looking at a single scenario, we looked at a range of scenarios. So you can see the range of scenarios in the box on the right-hand side, the 2-year, the 5-year, the 10-year, the 20-year, the 50-year, the 100-year. And these were based on events driven by both extratropical winter storms as well as post-tropical cyclones. And of course, we use the joint probability of surges and tides to put together, so you can see how the scenarios were put together. And these are all values that are based in the literature. So flood, not just looking at a single scenario, but looking at a range of flood scenarios. And then taking those scenarios and then adding sea level rise on top of that. So what do these conditions look like in the future? So we, as I mentioned, for the region, this region here, we use 3 different sea level rise scenarios. We use of course, the current day scenario. So this is actually imagery from Shippagan, one of the communities, a port community. We use a 0.5 meter global sea level rise. We use a 1 meter global sea level rise and a 2 meter sea level rise, and looked at the conditions for each one of the communities. Also taking into account the vertical land movement, adjustment for vertical land movement. And then again, for the risk assessment, we are looking at a range of different assets, and we worked closely with the community. You can see on the right-hand side some of the asset information that we've been collecting. This is kind of ongoing right now to get a sense of what the what's going to be exposed and what is vulnerable, what will be damaged. And we're using the CAN flood risk modeling tool for this purpose. So conclusions and next steps. So we're still finishing off some of the modeling and tweaking it and creating inundation maps and moving it into our risk assessment. We will then be connecting again with the community members and to make sure to validate and communicate what we found so far. And then of course, we're integrating all these lessons learned into the guideline that I've talked about. Now let's move to our last case study. So we're moving all the way up to the Arctic coast, moving to Tuktoyaktuk, and working with the hamlet in Tuktoyaktuk, as well as the community corporation. So you can see a couple of images. It's a community that's experienced a lot of coastal flooding in the past. So there we go. We're zooming in. For those of you who don't know where Tuktoyaktuk, way up on the Arctic coast, it's the only community connected with a road to the Arctic coast. That was recently implemented, and it's quite low-lying and has experienced quite a lot of storms and a lot of erosions. So community engagement, we've done a number of community engagement. One thing I want to highlight to you that may be of interest, we had a consultation with the elders of Tuktoyaktuk. We were asked by the community to make sure we engage with the elders, and you can see, I just put in a quote of one of the points for the elders, but they keep saying that one thing they were stressing is that they are seeing climate change happening right in front of them. It's increasing worse and worse and worse. We know that the temperature is rising much more in the north. The sea ice is changing. And they keep saying that the wind and the weather is getting worse. The wind's getting stronger. And it's, anyway, you can read the quote. But yeah, so it was really important to see how the elders are, from the elders, because the elders help guide discussion within the communities, and it's really important to get their guidance. Challenges with the models in the north, as well as in New Brunswick, are sea ice, because sea ice dampens the effects of storms. So we have to take that into account into our modeling effects. And especially as we see as the sea ice conditions are changing, wind is increasing, storms are getting more intense. Because of the sea ice being gone, it affects the models. So we also know that the storm surges are going to get worse in the future. And we didn't have a lot of photos to draw on to do our model validation. So we used some non-conventional methods to look at high water marks, and we used driftwood. So the location of where driftwood had been pushed up on land to get a sense of how far the storms had gone up land. So here's the regional model of Tuktoyaktuk, and you can see, maybe a little bit tricky to see, but on the right-hand side, so you can see it's quite large, covers a large region, and where it validates quite nicely. If you look at the squiggles on the right-hand side of the charts, they line up quite nicely to see with existing storm events. So there's the orange line of the model events and the measured lines of actual events from tide charts, tide levels, to get a sense. At the community scale, we know that this area is very, very low lying. It's as soon as you put by 2050, the area is going to be quite inundated. Most of the region, most of the community will be underwater. Quite serious conditions by 2100. So there's a lot of discussion right now happening within the community as to what to do with this information, how they can mitigate and deal with the impacts of increasing storms and sea level rise. And I'm just showing you on the right-hand side how some validation work we did in terms of working with the community to check and make sure the model worked in some cases, as well as the driftwood. So the other piece of interest, we're getting really close to the end here. I know there's quite a lot to cover, but the last piece, one piece I want to show you is with our CanFlood risk assessment tool, in particular in the north. One of the key pieces of our risk assessment is to have the use of damage curves, so flood depth damage curves, and we are developing some damage curves for Tuktoyaktuk. The structures are very different in the north. We didn't have existing damage curves to work with, so this is work that's underway right now. We're looking at about 5 different types of structures in the region to see how each one of these structures deals with different depths of floodwater. So getting close to the end, I've put some questions here for you to think of. I really want to hear back from you and see if this is useful information for you. So now you've got a sense about the guidelines. So are the guidelines useful for you? So I'm just putting these questions here to stimulate some discussion within our chat right here. So if you want to add comments into the chat, and Bohan will then ask, vocalize the questions so I can address them if possible. So are the guidelines, will they be useful for you? Yes, very, somewhat, not at all. And have you carried out a coastal flood hazard or risk assessment in your community before? Yes, no, or you hope to? And in what areas did you face challenges with your hazard or risk assessment? Did you, if you have done a risk assessment, have you had challenges accessing elevation data? Have you had challenges accessing some of the hazard data set? How do you deal with climate change data? Are you looking for, is there a lack of guidance and challenges with scenario selection? Are you using one scenario, multiple scenarios? Are you involving the community? So I just wanted to kind of put it back out to you, the audience, and let me know what you think and any challenges that you had. And I'd love to hear from you. So I'll leave these questions here before I go to the last slide. I don't know if I want to pass it to you, Bohan, if you see anything in the chat, or if you
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Nikki. So far, we don't have any questions yet. So I just wanted to remind everyone that if you do, in fact, have a question, feel free to ask it in the chat or in the Q&A feature. And Nikki will respond to that. But otherwise, yeah, it doesn't seem like we have a very lively crowd today.
Okay, no problem. Yes, not sure if I put everyone to sleep with too much information, but so there's something.
No, I think it was a very interesting discussion. I think we just got a smaller group today.
Yeah, no
so
sunny Friday here on the West Coast, so maybe people are outside today.
That's right. That's right. I know there was some flooding in some parts of southwestern Ontario, but at least in Toronto, it's not too bad right now. The weather looks pretty nice.
Yeah. But lots to think about in terms of coastal flooding, and there are many components. Yeah, and there may be some people on the call too that work as part of the team that you know, have questions or guidance, or if you want, yeah, it's not easy. And I've seen what I've seen so far is across the country there have been varying approaches in terms of how people have addressed coastal flooding. You know, and as you can see from the 3 case studies, the conditions and the situations are different across the country. Dealing with ice in some parts of the country, not dealing with ice, you know, and the open water conditions, and of course in the north we're also dealing with the permafrost. So when we get to the risk assessment side of things, the structures are built on the permafrost, and so they may not go as deep, and the foundations are slightly different than, say, in the other parts of the country. So how does that look like? Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what are the actual impacts now within the community. And yeah, it was interesting to hear about the saltwater intrusion for peatlands too, because peatlands is, I didn't know that peatland extraction was so big in the Atlantic region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably one of the challenges, right? Just the variability in the different regions.
Yeah, and the hard part is if, you know, expertise comes from, you know, more of the urban areas or other areas across the country, not where people are actually living, not knowing that some of these things that are important to the community. And so the community engagement piece, we learned a lot that community engagement was really, really important to understand what was a priority for the community. And, you know, if you do this work and you haven't looked at certain scenarios, and your scenarios can also include mitigation scenarios. So maybe you want to remodel your hazard model with the dike at a higher elevation or not without the dike, or if you want to put in a nature-based structure in front of it, or some different ways that you can play around with the model to see, or land use changes to see what your cost benefits are. And that's, you know, in future with the Ken flood modeling work, to look at some of those cost benefit approaches so that decisions can be sensible. You know, it's a lot of money to invest in infrastructure. We want to make sure that it's done in a way that's uses funds best. Yeah,
absolutely. And in general, how long do you think, or have you found it usually takes to do one of these assessments in one of these case studies?
Yeah, so they do take a while, and it really depends on a number of things. It depends on the scale you're working at. It depends on the data you have already existing. It's a very good question, though. Data you have already in the community. So as I mentioned, we flew water LiDAR data in Boundary Bay region. We didn't have to do that. We had good elevation data sets for the other two regions. But yeah, when there's limitations of data that you may need to spend more effort than you anticipate. That's why having that component at the beginning to make sure that the communities who are writing these RFPs to get consultants to do that work know that there may be, you may only have a certain amount of money, but if you have to spend a lot of it doing the elevation component, you may not have anticipated that need or that requirement. So it really depends on your requirements and needs. It can range. So yeah, and we're obviously, as a research team, we're taking our time to do the work, to be more comprehensive and to collect the best practices as we're going through it. So a consulting team may be a little bit quicker, or it can really range whether you're doing a regional scale assessment, a community scale assessment, and what you need.
Yeah, that's very interesting. As far as the timeline goes, you know, what do you kind of expect for you know, the progression of this hazard model, and then as well as the full risk model? You know, what kind of you know, tentative you know, timeline are you kind of expecting?
Yeah, so we're wrapping up. So we're working on the risk assessment right now, and we're wrapping up, as I mentioned, in 2022. We're also going to be publishing all the papers. So we've got a number of different publications already out of the work. So the intent is it should really all be complete by March 2022. So quite a bit of work to pull the pieces together still. Yeah, and engage with the communities. Yeah, we can't just publish the papers without first engaging with communities and making sure that what we do is meaningful and respectful to the communities, of course. So yeah, quite a bit of work still to be done.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that, you know, sometimes can be a little overlooked, and it's actually very important, right?
Yeah, it takes time, and you know, in some cases these are baseline studies, and as conditions change, you know, scenarios and models need to be redone. So and as I mentioned, the regional assessments can be useful for people who may be taking on new assessments. So for instance, the Atlantic regional assessment could be used, say, for communities in other parts of New Brunswick that could be used, the same model, right? So yeah,
absolutely,
to build your community scale model. Yeah, I'm going to put up my last slide. So that's my thank you slide, and just to, you know, make sure, there's my email too if you want to take a look at it. So we're looking for, as we're developing with our guideline, we're going to put together as expert committee. But if you're interested in being part of this expert committee, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to, love if you want to contribute. But yeah, this, you know, as I mentioned, it's not just about me, this project. As you can see, there are a lot of people involved in this work, and there's a lot of really good knowledge and science and understanding, and working with Indigenous knowledge that's coming out of the study, and we really want to make sure that we, as you mentioned, share this back with the community of practice afterwards, and that others can use to learn more. Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I think we can thank Nicky Hastings for giving a very interesting presentation. And we'll wrap it up for today. So thank you all for attending this webinar, and hopefully we'll see you in a future Friday Forum.